Good afternoon, everyone. Today, our special guest is Dr. Carol Taccetta, and she has done so much research into the FDA and into what we're now calling for is black box warnings for death on the COVID-19 mRNA injections. And we want to understand, why has the FDA refused to do this despite mounting evidence that they do indeed cause fatal death, particularly via myocarditis or deadly heart inflammation. So, Dr. Taccetta, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, and then we'll go into the deep investigative work that you have conducted.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nick, and Dr. McCullough for having me and asking me to be on this. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. My background is I'm a licensed physician in the U.S., and I've been working about 25 years in the industry. The latter part of my career has been in drug safety. I have a little bit of experience with public health. Back in the 80s, I'm kind of dating myself. I worked on one of the chapters in the Surgeon General 25-year time point of looking at attitudes on smoking, the Surgeon General's report on smoking. And I've just focused my career in the industry.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, let's get into it. We'll get into the massive amount of investigative scholarship you have done here, and I'll let you take the lead here. So tell us, what is a black box warning?
Okay, well, a box warning is certain contraindications or warnings that could lead to death or serious injury, and they may be required by the FDA to be presented in a box, a black box. And I'm sure many of you have seen that. And it's information critical for a prescriber to consider. And this discussion is timely based on Dr. McCullough's, the Senate hearing on COVID, and the hearing about the absence of warnings, appropriate warnings in the COVID vaccine labeling, which occurred on May 21st. And Dr. McCullough made it very clear that the current warning for myocarditis rises to the level of a black box. So basically, one has contraindications in the label and warnings and precautions in the label. And if it meets certain criteria, it rises to the level of a black box. So another aspect is, you may have noticed over the years, not every label has a black box, even if it includes the word death. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So a black box warning is usually used to highlight for prescribers one of the following situations. We can ignore this one because that's a lot of legal stuff. There is an adverse reaction so serious in proportion to the potential benefit from the drug, and it has these serious outcomes, fatal, life-threatening, or permanently disabling, that's essential to be considered in assessing the risks and benefits of using the drug. So right there, it's not a black and white decision, no pun intended. It's somewhat subjective, right? What is a risk-benefit or benefit-risk profile of the drug? For example, I just saw Dr. McCullough had sent a black box warning for gout. And in that, it said, consider the risks and benefits when prescribing or continuing this drug. So that's an important aspect that we should keep in mind during all the labeling discussion today. Another criterion is there's a serious adverse reaction, again, mainly fatal, life-threatening, or permanently disabling, that can be prevented or reduced in frequency or severity by appropriate use of the drug. And this could involve patient selection, careful monitoring, avoiding other medications at the same time, addition of another drug, or managing patients in a specific manner, or avoiding use in a specific clinical situation. And one other point I want to make is, you've heard of adverse events and adverse reactions, right? Well, the event is anything kind of untoward that can happen after you get a drug. a reaction is considered, I'm going to read my notes here, which I'll probably do throughout this. It's reasonably associated with the use of a drug. So that means there's some possible causality. It doesn't mean it's definitively related, but there's a reasonable association. And again, the risk is so significant that compared to the potential benefits, and then the other criterion is that it's preventable, or somehow the risk could be mitigated by adding a black box warning. Okay. Any questions? Just feel free to interrupt me anytime.
All right. No, it sounds very clear. Very
Okay,
clear.
good.
Yep.
Good. Okay, so I apologize in advance for this slide, and I probably should have made a couple slides. But over the time since, well, December of 2020 until July 30, 2023, when I decided to do my citizen petition for the black box warning, which is surprisingly easy to do, I found, there was just so much information that talked about why there should be a black box warning. Basically, there are the European Medicines Agency, the EMA. And as a pathologist, well, I don't practice pathology, but my board certification is in pathology. I'm very impressed by the mRNA and the staining and the autopsies and such. And back then, in March of 2021, they saw that low levels of messenger RNA could be detected in the heart. Okay, so that's biodistribution. That's from the preclinical study, the rat study. And I don't have the Pfizer biodistribution. The one that's out there is in Japanese, and I can't really cite that one because I'm not sure about it. I'm not part of the Japanese medical agency, but the reports, it states that several literature reports indicate that LNP formulated RNAs can distribute rather non-specifically to several organs such as the heart. So right there for the mRNA products, we know they can go to the heart, right? I mean, it's right there in black and white. And then early on, the late Dr. Arnie Burkhart and also Dr. Lang detected vaccine spike protein in the vessels of a person who died 4 months prior, post-vaccination. And the patient had vascular lesions and also vaccine-induced myocarditis in their assessment. And they used antibodies to the spike protein to detect that. There's a case report that talked about, although, I'm going to increase my screen. Yeah, perfect. There's a case report that talked about giving mRNA vaccination in patients that had myocarditis, or in a patient. And there was no history of COVID-19 for this patient. And they saw only spike protein, but not nucleocapsid protein. So suggesting that it was due to the vaccination rather than the viral infection of COVID. And another case series that talks about 15 patients with suspicion of myocarditis following vaccination. They detected spike protein in the heart. Oops, I'm so sorry. How do I get back to the other one?
Here we go. I can go right back.
Thank you so much. Another, and then, yours and Dr. McCullough's article, looking at the autopsy findings, a review of fatal cases at autopsy showing there's a high likelihood of a causal link between COVID and death from myocarditis. And then another manuscript that talked about 3 patients with vaccine in the heart that showed myocardial injury was initiated before or after the time of the most recent vaccine injection. And they detected mRNA in the human heart. And they said the mRNA vaccine in the heart is associated with myocardial injury. Now, I know there was a lot of discussion about this paper in terms of, well, was it mRNA? We know that mRNA can circulate in the bloodstream, and that it just happened to land maybe at a focus of injury in the heart just by its virtue of being in the blood. Well, regardless, and I can't speak to that, and I'm not a cardiologist, but we know that mRNA can be found in the heart in people with myocardial injury, right? And then lastly, This doesn't speak to the fatality of it, but the CDC committee back in 21, June of 21, finds likely association between COVID vaccines and myocarditis. So there we have the reasonable association. And then, of course, the VAERS database. And so July 23, I just want to mention, is the time when I decided to send the petition. And yeah.
So clearly they cause fatal myocarditis. It appears from this evidence, and so yeah, I'm interested to see, what else have you found?
Okay.
Why, like why are they just ignoring it?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that. Um, Speaking of VAERS, and this is just a current screenshot of what's there. I um, I noticed that the VAERS data, normally it's updated every couple weeks, but I think they're working on the system. And so as of April 25th of this year, we have almost 500 deaths reported with the preferred term, the PT of myocarditis. And preferred term is something that is it's called a MEDRA coding system. I know you're familiar with it. And it's used to code, it's not an ICD code, but it's a code used to label events in industry and in, such. And I just wanted to know, and by the way, most of these are, there's some Janssen's there because I looked at all COVID-19 vaccines and all bivalents, the COVID-2 and VAERS. And I searched for the PT myocarditis. And the rest are all, maybe there are some unknown, but most of them are Moderna and Pfizer. And if you look at the onset interval, I mean, just for the Moderna that I have shown, you see 0 to 1 day. So, and keep in mind, when the Janssen vaccine was paused for thrombosis, they had fewer events, I think 54 events, I can't remember correctly, but they mentioned a clustering in time of the events, right? In temporal, in time relationship to the vaccine injection. I use the word vaccina, but loosely. And so again, onset interval is very important. I mean, one can look at, background rates of events, an aggregate, looking at all the data together. But even if you don't have a signal that shows up because it's different than the background rate in the population, and you're the expert in this as an epidemiologist, you can have some very important index events or case events that still would show a signal. And those would be ones that are very, very closely temporally related to the drug or vaccine in this case. What I want to mention too is there is no MEDRA term for subclinical or asymptomatic myocarditis. So we really don't have good information on that. And that subclinical is, maybe there are a few symptoms, I think, but a lot of people with subclinical myocarditis have myocardial injury and they don't even know it. And then as of that date, over 18,000 life-threatening events were reported with the preferred term myocarditis. Again, a lot of these are Janssen. There are about 50 of them, mostly Moderna and Pfizer. And I looked, and less than 10 were from an unknown manufacturer. As of April 25, almost 1,000 permanently disabling events reported with myocarditis. And one caveat is some of these might be the same event. So I don't know if they're the same event or not. And we look at anaphylactic reaction and anaphylactic shock. I looked at both of those. And as of April, there were 75 deaths reported with those preferred terms. And over 1,700 life-threatening events reported with those terms. And as you would expect, the onset interval is often 0 days because it happens on the day of injection. So what are the current vaccines? Right now, we have four, sorry. One just got approved over the weekend. A biological license application, a BLA, is when a drug is approved, right? Uses the USPI package insert. And that's for Comirnaty, Spikevax, Another Nuvaxovid, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing these, just approved May 16th. And next spike, just approved, was it over the weekend? I think. And all these things are making me have to work harder on my presentation. I thought I was done, you know. And then, so these are for patients 12 to 64 who have at least one underlying condition that puts them at high risk for severe outcomes. And then the ones that are EUA versus BLA, EUA means authorized versus approved, right? And these use fact sheets for healthcare providers. And these are for the children. My Pfizer and Moderna, 6 months to 11 years, and Novavax, 12 and older.
There's a lot of COVID vaccines still sitting there on the market.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And so back in July of 2023, I've been working with Dr. Naomi Wolf and Amy Kelly's team with the Daily Cloud. And, you know, honestly, I first started writing to the FDA to Dr. Peter Marks in December 2020, asking for a pause on the vaccines. At that time, due to the anaphylaxis, saying we really don't know what's causing this. Is it an PEG antibody? Let's Even a black box warning wouldn't help at that time if we didn't know what was going on. So let's pause it. So really, I've asked for a pause since December of 2020. And by the way, I met Dr. Peter Marks at a DIA conference a few years prior. This is a Drug Enforcement Association, or not Drug Enforcement, Drug Information Association, I think. And we discussed causality of adverse events, which is very interesting. So I kind of felt like I could write to him, and I don't know if he remembered me, but I just felt like, okay, who can I write to about these things that I have concerns about? And I chose him. And so, back, and this isn't from, I couldn't find out where, or the page is missing that I could find for what were the bivalent vaccines back in 2023. So I'm using the citation from the Daily Cloud. And back then, there were 3 COVID vaccines available in the US, all under EUA, which means investigational / experimental. And these were the ones that were there. And the regulations, as you know, are different for EUA products versus approved products, right? Authorized versus approved. And here's a fact sheet for Paxlovid. And this was the case then, as well as now, that it has a black box warning. This is what that looks like. And so I thought, okay, at the time, these are EUA drugs. Paxlovid has an EUA product, has a black box warning. Maybe I can add black box warnings to these or request it, right? So then basically in my assessment at that time, I need to note that I saw many other observed serious adverse reactions, in my opinion, that were not mentioned in the product labeling. At the time, the ones in warning, the ones that could rise to the black box warnings were myocarditis and anaphylaxis. So those are the ones I focused on. And keep in mind, I don't want to suggest that I thought a black box warning would be sufficient at this time. It's just that, as you know, by 2023, I was kind of scratching my head as to why these were still on the market. And I just did whatever I could do to try to make a difference. So it's not perfect, but it might be a baby step, right? And I also didn't cite a ton of literature. I figured the FDA had all that, and they have the VAERS, they have the internal insurance data, they have all the literature. And I did use one article, but basically I tried to, as a standalone document, use their fact sheet and their hyperlinks to CDC guidelines in my arguments. And so I took a different tack. So here's my citizen petition. And I wanted 3 things done. I wanted box warnings added to contraindications, box warnings added to management of acute allergic reactions under warnings and precautions, and a box warning under myocarditis and pericarditis under warnings and precautions. And remember, contraindications and warnings and precautions in a label are the sections that can rise to the level of a black box warning. And so this is a bit of a busy slide. So I highlighted that the parts that, I was arguing. So here's contraindications. This is actually part of my citizen petition, which is on regulations.gov. And I thought the criterion met was for contraindications to highlight warning information. And my argument was that although the current warning information under contraindications, which is don't administer if they have a severe allergic reaction, a history of an allergic reaction or of the vaccine or any component, it's accurate, but a box warning would highlight front and center this critical information to vaccine providers. And at that time, the vaccine, it says current, but at that time in 2023, the fact sheets mentioned this contraindication only on page 2 or 3 of the fact sheet. So I thought it would just help to highlight. Today, the information is on the first page of the USPI for approved drugs, as well as the fact sheets for EUA drugs, which is okay. And then this same link now is in the EUA fact sheets, but not, okay, so basically under management of acute allergic reactions, it says appropriate treatment should be used to manage immediate allergic reactions, and it has to be immediately available in the event of an acute anaphylactic reaction. And it has this link for guidelines, a CDC link. And this is present in the EUA fact sheets today, but it's not surprisingly present in the USPI, the approved labeling, this link. So, and there's some critical information here. And I just have this for all 3 drugs. And it's also important to remember that if you have a paper copy, you obviously can't go to the link, right? And I'm just thinking in a crisis situation, it would be kind of hard to follow a bunch of links. But I know there's other summary information they provide to vaccine providers. And I'm sure there's a lot of preparation before a vaccine center can, start injecting. They have to be very familiar with how to treat anaphylaxis. But if it's a paper product, they don't have the link, obviously. And so in my argument, I also say there's the box warning criteria met include that it's life-threatening, and following the link within warning and precautions to the CDC link, it does acknowledge anaphylaxis is life-threatening and acute and potentially life-threatening. It's actually potentially fatal, but life-threatening works. And another criterion met was that there's a serious adverse reaction that can be prevented or reduced in frequency or severity by appropriate use of the drug through all these means. And I mentioned that in contraindications, it meets one of the criterion for avoiding use in a specific clinical situation. This is all kind of dry, but I'll just run through it quickly. Under the CDC link within warning and precautions, it discusses patient selection. Also in warning and precautions, it talks about monitoring for the occurrence of immediate adverse reactions, i.e. careful monitoring. Where is that? Right here. Also in the link, it talks about addition of another drug. And that's when patients' home epinephrine might be helpful if they have a history of an allergy or allergic reactions, I should say, or anaphylaxis. And then under warnings and precautions, appropriate medical treatment must be immediately available. And that refers to managing patients in a specific manner. And some of this is not all critical to be in a box warning, but I just put out every part of it that I could look at for them to assess. But some of it could be easily visible and accessible in a box warning. So key points, and this is when you go in the link in the fact sheet, it takes you to these guidelines in the CDC website. Interim considerations, preparing for the potential management of anaphylaxis after COVID-19 vaccination. And there they discuss the initial assessment and potential management of anaphylaxis. And they also discuss in the same page post-vaccination observation periods. And they say providers should consider observing all vaccine recipients for 15 minutes after vaccination and sometimes more in certain cases. And they also mentioned symptoms of anaphylaxis often occur within 15 to 30 minutes of vaccination, although it can sometimes take several hours for symptoms to appear. And that can happen. There can be delayed anaphylactic reactions. There could be something called biphasic anaphylactic reactions where you have it and then you don't, and then you have it. So again, this applies to the careful monitoring criterion that it couldn't prevent or maybe the anaphylactic reaction and maybe not reduce the frequency, but it could affect the severity. And it's also important in counseling patients to be aware of these possible symptoms. And again, this link is only available online, not in paper. And then the next petition request, the third one actually, involved myocarditis pericarditis. And today, the USPI for approved products and the fact sheets for EUA products both contain this link. And here they talk about the post-marketing data, increased risk of myocarditis and pericarditis, especially the first week following vaccination. And by the way, I'm just choosing the Pfizer products just for simplicity of this presentation. Of course, Moderna, Novavax, and others all have this. The observed risk is highest in males 12 to 17. Although some cases required intensive care support, available data from short-term follow-up suggests that most individuals have had resolution of symptoms with conservative management. Information is not yet available about potential long-term sequelae. And the CDC has published considerations related to myocarditis and pericarditis after vaccination, including for vaccination of individuals with a history of myocarditis or pericarditis. So right here, I would think, okay, so if you had a 16-year-old boy who walked into your clinic or grocery store and was ready to have the vaccine, would you automatically know to look here? I mean, I would hope you would, but the way it reads, it says these are considerations related to myocarditis after vaccination and for patients with a history of myocarditis or pericarditis. But it doesn't talk about patient screening, patient selection, extended intervals, as we'll talk about in a minute. And I mentioned that both the USPI and the fact sheet contain this link. So again, I thought one of the criterion met was that it's fatal, life-threatening, or permanently disabling. And my argument was, even though they don't mention those words in the labeling, that some cases required intensive care support, suggesting a potentially fatal, life-threatening, or permanently disabling outcome. Again, I was trying to use their own words for my arguments. I wasn't trying to provide any evidence because I figured they all had that, and you know, the words, the black box warning or the word fatal was not still in the labeling. And another criterion was that, again, this is going to get kind of complicated in this slide, but that the reaction could be prevented or reduced in frequency or severity. Again, reaction, they agree that it's, acknowledge that it's causally related. And in warning and precautions, remember I showed you that CDC link. It talks about patient selection, such as history of myocarditis or pericarditis. They talk about age or gender-related risk. In warnings and precautions, and the CDC link, it talks about careful monitoring, the first week after vaccination, assessing for specific symptoms, especially in non-specific symptoms in younger children. And the CDC link, it talks about managing patients in a specific manner and adjusting the vaccine dosing interval to 8 weeks in some people. That was the language used then. And adjusting dosing when you're combining COVID-19 with other vaccines. And then also in the CDC link, avoiding use in a specific clinical situation applies to those with a history of myocarditis or pericarditis after any dose of the vaccine, and subsequent dosing of the vaccine should generally be avoided. And this is really critical information that's only found in the CDC guideline. And I would not, the box warning would be 3 pages long if you put everything in there. But there's some aspects especially that I think would have been really helpful, especially with the amount of people that are getting these vaccines, maybe not so much with these bivalents by then, but with the mandates and just the way it was deployed in this country. And so the link in the labeling takes you to this page, and on it, it talks about follow-up of patients with myocarditis, and they ask you to consult 2 links from the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology. And of course, I'm not an expert in this area, but I'll talk about it. Dr. McCullough would be better to speak about this. So the American Heart Association doesn't mention anything about post-vaccination myocarditis. And the ACC guidance does talk about evaluation and management. Return to play, they say strenuous physical activity should be avoided for 3 to 6 months, as outlined in the RTP return to play section. They do describe an individual who died of post-vaccination myocarditis. So it exists, even in the CDC website, because that website refers you to this website where there's an article. And then it also refers you to CDC guidelines recommending that no further doses of any COVID-19 vaccine be given to those who develop myocarditis following COVID-19 vaccination, which I also think should probably be in contraindications. And then again, it talks about, basically these items talk about preventing or reducing in frequency or severity. Remember, one of the black box criteria, such as avoiding use in a specific situation, managing patients in a specific manner. And then, let's see, sorry, getting a little, there's a lot of pages here. Then it takes you, this same page, it takes you to another link. Yeah, a further link takes you to this page, I guess. Patient selection is discussed here in terms of age and gender, managing patients in a specific manner by extending the interval to 8 weeks, careful monitoring, which is counseling, and these all prevent or reduce the event, the reaction in frequency or severity. So this is a really big one. Extending the interval to 8 weeks between the first and second doses for some people might reduce the risk of vaccine-associated myocarditis and pericarditis. And I just think, again, with the number of people taking this, number of children and young adults especially, that this would have been important information. And again, this is not on the paper copy. This is, several links down, right? And it says males age 12 to 39 should be made aware of the real risk, and the option for extended interval between doses should be made aware. And of course, it talks about counseling. So what was the FDA's response? Basically, they said they denied everything. They said your proposed box warning addition to the fact sheets is not required by statute or regulation. And I kind of learned a few things along the way. I thought I was good because Paxlovid had it, but I'll talk about that. As an initial matter as noted above, the labeling for the authorized, the EUA products, is not subject to 21 CFR 201.57, which means, remember in the beginning I showed you those black box criteria? That was 21 CFR. Oh, sorry, that wasn't 21 CFR. Those were the guidelines, but not subject to that. This is the code, the Federal Register, including the provision regarding box warnings. That was one of the things I showed you, but not the guidelines, sorry. However, because we would generally evaluate the need for a box warning for a vaccine authorized under EUA consistent with how we would evaluate the need for such a warning for an approved vaccine, we address your arguments. Nonetheless, we disagree with me that a black box warning, that I assert the inclusion of the warning in the provider fact sheets is warranted. Okay. And then it goes on to say that there are 3 vaccines authorized under EUA. And they mentioned that this is in 2023, the original monovalent Pfizer and Moderna are no longer authorized. And then this is where it gets, I'm not a lawyer, but the FDA, I'm trying to understand this. The FDA has also approved 2 COVID-19 vaccines. So they mention there are these 3 EUAs that are available, and then also 2 COVID-19 vaccines. And you know the story behind this, that on 21, they approved the BLA and yeah, for these products, for Comirnaty and Spikevax. And then they go on to say the petition requests the FDA amend the labeling of all 3 currently available COVID-19 vaccines. So I guess by doing that, I just put their focus on the authorized products, not the approved products. We therefore interpret the petition's request to refer to the following vaccines that are currently authorized for use. So not the originally approved COVID BLA vaccines, but only the EUA vaccines. So for purposes of this response, we hereafter refer to these 3 vaccines collectively as authorized COVID-19 vaccines. So, okay, petition asserts that one such regulation should govern this and that it applies to EUA. We do not agree. The labeling conditions for authorized products are governed by Section 564 of the FD&C Act. Okay, and what is that? The Section 564 does not even describe black box warnings. Okay, so that's what that is. And this is the emergency use authorization of medical products and related authorities. So what do they say specifically about anaphylaxis? At that time, you know, when you know, the vaccines were approved, we did not. Do you hear a strange noise? Okay,
Do we
maybe not.
drink what?
Do you hear a strange noise, like a boom? Okay, never
No,
mind.
I do not.
Good.
I do not.
That's cool. That's great. So the potential for the reason they denied it, the potential for severe allergic reaction is not unique to these vaccines. That's true. And the known and potential benefits of these vaccines are significant. So this is where, remember in the very beginning, that the guidelines say to consider the risk and the benefits in putting a black box warning on. So at first I thought they kept mentioning this because they're describing the EUA criteria, you know, a known benefit, known or potential risk, you know, or potential benefit. But I also am thinking maybe they're describing the risk benefit profile, in their opinion, of the vaccines. And they also said that appropriate medical treatment to manage immediate allergic reactions must be available in the event of an acute allergic reaction, that was enough information for the practitioner. And so basically, they were assessing the ADR as, is it so serious in proportion to the potential benefit? And I imagine that was one of their criteria where they thought the benefit exceeded the risk. I'm not sure. What I would say to this is that at the time, these are EUA products, and they still are for children today. And so they're investigational, you know, they're experimental. And we really don't know the time course of the anaphylaxis, you know, we don't, or any of the course of the anaphylaxis. We don't know the details of it because it's an investigational product. So that's what I would say to that. But it's true, you know, all vaccines don't mention this. And the observation period, I think, is the most important thing that could have been into the black box warning, because that's really critical. And I also want to mention, and I'll get to this later, but with the change with the new ACIP guidelines with the CDC on not recommending it for healthy children and pregnant women, has the benefit risk profile changed? And we'll talk about that a little bit. And this is just a reminder that no one uses the word experimental, but it's there. An experiment is any use of a drug except for the use of a marketed drug in the course of medical practice. The safety profile is still being explored. So, what did the FDA respond about myocarditis? That most cases of myocarditis and pericarditis are relatively mild, and the individuals recover without consequences. And they go on to say that the current warning is good enough, that under warnings and precautions, and the known and potential benefits are significant, and the FDA has determined that they outweigh the known and potential risks of the vaccines.
Hmm.
Yeah, so again, I think and I'll get to this later. I think this is a really good kind of time point, with the FDA and the CDC to maybe rethink the benefit risk profile in all aspects. I would assume that the benefit risk profile, their assessment has changed in that they're no longer recommending it for healthy children and adults. I can't speak to their mindset, but that's what I would imagine has happened.
Right, right, and it's unfortunate that, in my opinion, they are still, they're still going to be recommending them to, young kids with at least what they call their CDC defined comorbidities.
Yeah.
So it's just, yeah, I feel like what I, well, at least what I want is, I want these completely off the market, and that's
Mhm.
the end goal. But this is so important as well, because we gotta try everything we can to alert the public to their real harms. And it's so concerning that despite all the evidence, that there's still no that this was their response to you. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. And what do you know what reference 59 is there? What
Yeah,
where they
yeah. Well,
claim it's mild?
I'll get to that a few slides down. It's interesting. Um, I could tell you now that's basically literature citations. It doesn't describe VAERS reports, doesn't describe any internal data such as insurance claims or anything like that, or the other surveillance systems they have. It might talk about some links to the CDC and such, but basically it's a lot of literature. And here again, so even if this was true, that most cases of this myocarditis and pericarditis are relatively mild, extending the interval to 8 weeks would have greatly improved, uh, or possibly reduced in severity, possibly frequency, the ADR. And yeah, and also again mild and recover without consequences, as we discussed, based on, well, we haven't discussed this yet, based on the new safety information to be added to the labels, which just occurred in the last few weeks. I'm not sure that this is consistent with the new labeling to be added. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking at my 10,000 notes here. Yeah. And then they go on to say, in the provider fact sheets, we will look at additional post-marketing data as it accrues over time. We'll continue to evaluate the data. Okay, so this is where it discusses, or I discuss footnote number 59. So I wrote Dr. Marks after this and I said, thank you for your response. And I said, regarding the statement, most cases of myocarditis and pericarditis are relatively mild and the individuals recover without consequences. May I ask your opinion as to the significance of the 43,212 myocarditis cases with serious outcomes as reflected in the VAERS data? And so I should mention death, permanent disability, and life-threatening are just 3 of the serious outcomes. The other ones are hospitalization, important medical event, things like that. So I just chose the ones that affect the black box warning. So as of September 1st, worldwide cases of this preferred term, the meta-term myocarditis, were reported for the vaccines, the COVID-19 and COVID-19 2, which is the bivalent. Close to 16,000 for Moderna, 99 deaths, 175 permanent disability, 424 life-threatening, over 51,000 for Pfizer, 299 deaths, 674 permanent disability, close to 1,300 life-threatening, and 1 for Novavax. By restricting the search to serious outcome only, I got a total of over 43,000. And this is my own homegrown VAERS search. It's nothing, that's been QC'd or anything like that, but this is what I got. And yeah, so Dr. Marks says, thank you. We'll acknowledge, reply in due course. And then there's some back and forth that I didn't want to bore you with, thank you. And I would have you received this, can you acknowledge this? And then I say, Dr. Marks, thanks for looking into this. The reason the box warnings were not added at the time was for this reason that they just gave. And then I say, even if most cases are indeed mild, still there are many serious cases that can be prevented or reduced in frequency or severity with the box warning. Please keep in mind also that the vaccines are approved for 12 and up as of yesterday, so would fall under the CFR regulations for box warnings and approved products. Remember, there are two kind of sets of regulations. I look forward to your urgent response, and then I provide the FDA guidance. And they returned back to me and said, this is where they talk about 59. Thank you for your inquiry. And this is your emails to Dr. Marks were forwarded to our office for response. Refer you to footnote 59. It's a tongue twister of our response to your citizen petition. This footnote contains the information that FDA has available provide. Okay.
So footnote 59, was that what I brought up earlier? Where they claim it's mild? Yeah.
So this is a footnote for that. Most cases are relatively mild. The individuals recover with consequences. And I don't have all of it, but they cite literature, outcomes at least 90 days after the vaccination. This was more of a short-term follow-up. Lancet, in different journals, and they also, I think, have some references to the CDC and such. Okay.
I would like to say Nathaniel Mead is the first author on a manuscript. Dr. McCullough cited that in his Senate testimony. We got over like 300 references that literally compiles all of that myocarditis evidence. And it's so clear when you actually take into account all of the evidence, unlike they do, that it's very severe. Like over 90% get hospitalized. A large proportion have lasting heart damage, myocardial abnormalities, and it's like a 10 to 20% fatality rate. Significantly shortens life expectancy. It's bad, and it's so bad that the FDA claims it's nothing.
And Nick, and you might better remember this, but the one article I attached was yours. And in July of 23, it had just gotten into print. Do you remember?
With yes, autopsy findings and
so I actually did provide that. Yeah. So on the first page of the USPI, and this is again example Comirnaty, just so you can see there are no box warnings, but if there was one to appear, it would appear on this first page. And then later on in the full prescribing information, this is highlights, and then it goes on to full prescribing information. And Spikevax is very similar. So a few pages in, you see the contraindications and warnings and precautions. So this is not, this is like a few pages in. And you see this is again today's labeling for the approved product. You see the contraindications. And it's interesting, unlike the EUA fact sheets, there's no link to the CDC guidelines for anaphylaxis, which is interesting. And I don't know why it would be in the fact sheets, but not in the USA labeling. I mean, the USPI labeling. And here are the current warning and precautions in Comirnaty. And it's similar to what we discussed. There's no critical information about counseling, about symptoms. There's not even mention here. I mean, forget the black box warning for a second. There's not even mentioning about the extended interval for 8 weeks for patients, especially that are more high risk. Yeah. And again, if you were reading this, you would say, how would you know about the extended interval in the labeling itself, in the actual standalone document? Because here it talks about, okay, so if you're a healthy 16-year-old boy comes in, if a healthy 16-year-old boy comes in, you're thinking that this link has to do with, again, considerations related to these issues after vaccination or patients with a history. So what is a new safety information. And I can't remember, was it like 2 weeks ago they were going to add this? Yeah, something like that.
No, that was like right before I think the Senate testimony too.
Yeah, or like the day of, or something like, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Posted on, yeah, on the FDA website on May 21st. I'm sorry, this is like so complicated. It's hard for me to keep
Yeah,
this
this is a
straight.
lot of
Yeah,
stuff, right? Everything's just buried in there.
thank you. And they talk about the safety labeling changes. And apparently, these changes, according to CBS News, began late in 2024, but had not yet been finalized as officials wrestled with how to accurately present the findings. And they were posted on the FDA website on May 21st. And they were based on data from analyses of commercial health insurance claims, inpatient, outpatient, with the highest estimated incidence of myocarditis or pericarditis following administration of the most recent, well, not the most recent, the 23-24 vaccines. And then they're also based on results from a post-approval Lancet study in patients with COVID-19 vaccine-associated myocarditis. And, the incidence, again, just if you're like me, you kind of forget what it means sometimes. It measures the rate at which new cases of a disease occur in a population over a specific period of time as compared to prevalence. And we don't have access to number one. That's internal data for the FDA and CDC. And so what did the post-approval study show? It showed persistence of abnormal cardiac magnetic resonance, CMR. This is kind of an MRI, imaging findings that are a marker for myocardial injury at a median follow-up of about 5 months post-vaccination. So I think this would be considered more of a midterm study, but kind of longer than before that they used. But now we're getting more follow-up compared to one of the citations in footnote 59 before, right? That was shorter term. And they go on to say, despite a mild initial clinical course, the injury was evidenced by higher troponin and LGE, late gadolinium enhancement on CMR, the magnetic resonance study. And they said, despite a mild initial clinical course, these findings are common in patients with COVID-19 vaccine-associated myocarditis, or CVAM. So again, remember in the petition, it talked about how most cases are mild, right? From the FDA, they said that. And then now we're saying, okay, despite the mild initial course, you have these changes. And, I'm not a radiologist, but LGE, I guess, can appear with either acute changes or chronic changes. So that's interesting. And then they go on to say, it's associated with propensity for arrhythmias, heart failure, and sudden cardiac death. So that will come in important later on as we discuss a few more things. And they also said myocardial scarring persists during convalescence in most patients. So there were no deaths in the study, but the scarring represents, to me, a permanent disability. This can be a foci for arrhythmias, and Dr. McCullough can speak more to that, but that's pretty concerning in my opinion.
So that was the study that prompted that new safety warning they put,
That, as
which
well as the insurance data that showed that the highest estimated incidence was in this other age group. Yeah.
so why
So
didn't they put in the new warning that it causes long-lasting heart damage? They didn't put that there, did they?
no, and I'll get to that in a second. So then these are these are the highlights of the prescribing information. Remember, these are the changes they're being asked to do. Like it was sent in April, I think, and they had 30 days. So I don't know where it is right now. But again, this is the highlights of the prescribing information, and that's followed by the full prescribing information. And so they're asking, the FDA is asking Pfizer in this case, you used to say the observed risk is highest in males 12 to 17. We'd like you to change it to 16 to 25 for males. And then this is interesting. I just highlighted the thing. We can all look at this later, but it's interesting. They looked at the insurance data for individuals 6 months through 64 years. And it's like, As Dr. McCullough mentions, he mentioned a patient in his 70s or 70 that just had myocarditis. And I mean, it can occur in all ages and both genders. Most are males for sure. But sorry, but it can occur in all ages. And I don't know why they stopped at 64. And they do go on to say about 5 months post-vaccination, persistence of abnormal CMR findings are a marker for myocardial injury, and that was common. And this is interesting. The clinical and prognostic significance of these findings is not known. I mean, well, yes, it's a novel vaccine. Well, they probably wouldn't like me to say that, but it's still, in my opinion, a novel platform. And do they know exactly what the findings mean? No. But we do know, the world of cardiology should know what happens when you have these findings, right? When there's scarring, when there are LGE findings, what is the prognostic significance of that? I don't understand why that's unknown completely. And
Right.
Dr.
Well,
Mike,
the study itself said it means risk of sudden cardiac death, right?
yeah, propensity for it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And but they don't include that here.
No, they don't.
And they just claim, oh, well, we don't know. We're one of the biggest regulatory agencies in the world, and we don't know anything. Just ridiculous.
And then this is the other parts they're requesting. They do say that they do describe that most of them had, most the patients had the symptoms following the second dose, 278 versus 33 following the first dose, and a fewer number following a final booster dose. Among the 307 patients who had been diagnosed with vaccine-associated myocarditis, 89 reported symptoms at a median follow-up of 91 days. And then they go on further to discuss the CMR findings, myocardial injury. 98 had persistence of LGE. And again, the statement that the clinical and prognostic significance of these findings is not known. So these next couple slides will just talk a little bit about my concerns with the new labeling. So just using Moderna and Pfizer as examples. Before, they said the highest risk was males 18 to 24 in Moderna and Pfizer 12 to 17. The new labels request changes to say that males 16 to 25 for both mRNA vaccines should be what's included. So my concerns are, why remove the warning for ages 12 to 15 from community labeling? Because the CDC says still on their link that people, especially males 12 to 39, should be made aware of the risks. And then why are people at age 26 to 39, like, so we just talked about the lower range, and now the upper range, 26 to 39 excluded, right, as per the CDC link. And then also my concern, this language of highest estimated incidence. I mean, unless you're a statistician, a lot of people might read this and think, okay, well, that group, is at risk, but it might give a false sense of safety for those outside that age range or gender. Yeah. And then the other concerns I have are about the midterm or / long-term, however you want to say it, Lancet study. Still in the labeling, it says, although some cases required intensive care support, so the FDA did not ask them to change this. To my understanding, available data from short-term follow-up suggests that most patients have had resolution of symptoms with conservative management. Information is not yet available about potential long-term sequelae. So I think these things need to be revised. The statement about clinical and prognostic significance of these CMR findings is not known. And I know Dr. McCullough can speak to that. The other thing that needs to be revised is this whole big statement here that I just read, because we saw that based on the Lancet study that 89 or 28% of patients reported cardiac symptoms at a median follow-up of 91 days since receiving the vaccine. So, yeah, just a statement about resolution of symptoms with conservative management. I think this needs to be in there, but it's not to my knowledge, right? No,
But
I think,
yeah, so they don't put the black box warning like we want, and they don't even get something so small like this correct, and it's just so they can't even get the one side effect, myocarditis. They can't even get that right. Um, I mean, it's just ridiculous at this point, right? I mean, because it's so like it's so serious because you know these are people's lives, right? And so it's like we got to get this stuff right, and they're not getting it right, and so I'm concerned because this is, we have a new FDA, it appears, but they're still doing the same sort of tricks and nonsense. And I want to just say one thing about this journal publication cartel is what I call it. They only like in their reports, they basically only give studies out of Lancet or New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, all these what are called esteemed journals. And they don't include our studies in there that find the real risks, because they're not published in Lancet, etc. And so they have that gatekeeping mechanism where the top journals will only publish studies that are pro-vaccine. And so it's like it's so hard to get our studies into those journals. So and since they're not, these guys are just going to claim our studies aren't credible.
yeah, I encountered that back in 2020. I wrote an opinion piece on 5G safety, 5G EMF radiation, and I couldn't get it. I had to actually finally found an open access journal that would accept it. Yeah, personally, I if I see something in one of the bigger journals, I I'm very skeptical. Let's just say that. So yeah, so all these things could really, make people more aware of, wow, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to have a propensity for heart failure potentially or sudden cardiac death? So none of this is included, right? And yeah, I'm trying to think of what else. Um, yeah, and then again, remember in the petition it said despite a mild clinical course. Um, most cases of myocarditis and pericarditis are relatively mild, and the individuals recover without consequences. That was in the FDA response in my petition. Well, you can see that this, changes things, and I'm actually happy this is in there somewhat because I mean they need to add more. I think it needs to be revised, but I'm doing cartwheels that they're even discussing this, to be honest. Um, yeah, and again, this is I know they need longer term studies. I'm not sure if those are ongoing, but I hope they are. But even if without, we kind of know what scarring or fibrosis in the heart does. I mean, that's kind of a well understood phenomenon in the world of medicine. So this is very interesting. I looked up other countries. I didn't look up all countries, but I looked up the MHRA, which is the UK equivalent of the FDA, for what they said in Comirnaty. And in fact, they say that fatal cases of myocarditis and pericarditis have been observed. So they mention it. And they also, it's not in a black box, but it's good that it's here. They talk about close observation for at least 15 minutes after vaccination for anaphylaxis. And they talk about a little bit more under this heading of myocarditis and pericarditis that they talk about counseling, they talk about some of the symptoms, and they give some of the symptoms, because, a lot of people experiencing chest pain, they just may not know right away what, what that might be symptomatic of. So here we get into finally talking more about risk and benefit. So for EUA products, remember authorized products, they say the known and potential benefits of the product, et cetera, outweigh the known and potential risks of the product. Everything is potential. right? Because it's an emergency situation. But when something is approved, its benefits of the drug outweigh the risks. And they have to determine the drug is safe and effective. And they've also considered substantial evidence of effectiveness to support licensure. The FDA considers the benefit risk assessment over the drug's life cycle, acknowledging that our understanding of the benefits and risks change over time as new information about the effectiveness or safety becomes available. So again, I go back to the new ACIP CDC recommendations. Has the benefit risk profile changed in their minds? I would gather that it did, if we're no longer recommending it for healthy children and pregnant women. So that's changed. And then what else has changed? So in terms of also the guidance for approved products, right, goes on to say, when the beneficial effects of a drug are modest or highly variable in the population, and prediction and mitigation of serious irreversible adverse events is difficult, they might consider, the benefit risk profile. Now, by now, we have a lot of data that shows that this does not affect transmission. Well, I'm going to be careful what I say. There's a lot of data concerning the topic of transmission, I should say. And we certainly know that some of the adverse events are irreversible. And it's interesting, they go on to say, in certain circumstances, the benefit risk assessment incorporates broader public health considerations, which is what we're talking about now, for the intended patient population and others. For example, in the review of drugs, including vaccines, to diagnose, prevent, or treat communicable diseases, risks related to disease transmission are important considerations. And smarter people than I can speak about the disease transmission aspect and the preventability of the COVID vaccine with transmission. I mean, it's not really a clear indication for that, right? So that whole risk benefit ratio, I think, needs to be examined. So what to do, right? I think I don't have the other slide. There are different stepwise approaches. One is to add or update critical safety information to the contraindications or warnings and precautions language. The new safety labeling, although I don't agree with it all, is a step here, right? Another more serious would be to add boxed warnings. More serious would be to pause and use to evaluate safety. This is something I recommended in December of 2020. And then the last is remove from market. And I'm not even sure, I know this talk is on boxed warnings and it'd be great. I do cartwheels if they were added, but are they even sufficient in light of today's benefit risk landscape? So, and I think the landscape has changed based on the recent Senate hearing about the dangers of myocarditis with these injections, the new ACIP recommendations, the new safety information from the Lancet study just added, the fact that children are still being given experimental products based on the risk. I mean, actually, any healthy child or pregnant woman can still go in and take it, to my understanding. It's just not being recommended for them. But it's being recommended for children that are in riskier categories. And then also something that Dr. McCullough has brought to awareness is a lack of information regarding subclinical vaccine-associated myocarditis incidence and detection. I mean, how common is this? Do we need more troponin studies? Do we need to do, CMRs on people who have, that those are guidelines that need to be discussed. And, also there are non-vaccine alternatives, maybe even prevention and treatment. I mean, right now I kind of follow the McCullough protocol. I daily do, and this is not medical advice. I do the nasal iodine. I do the spray xylitol mouthwash. I take vitamin D. I take vitamin C. I try to do the right things to stay healthy, not just for COVID, but for, any kind of respiratory illness. And I've only gotten COVID once, and it was no joke. I mean, my husband and I were trying to sell our home at the time, and we were fatigued for 2 months. We couldn't, it was really awful. but I used a protocol then, um, kind of my own protocol. I kind of combined the McCullough protocol with the FLCCC protocol and the Dr. Zelensky protocol. I created my own, to be honest, and we made it out fine. And I'm a physician, so I kind of knew what to look for, but we need to do more studies on alternative treatments. No one in my family has taken the COVID vaccine. Um, my son, when he was no longer a minor, but he was pretty young in 2020, and he wanted to make some money to be in a clinical trial for COVID vaccines, and I gave him money. I gave him $1,600, probably too much money, to not be in it, with a promise that he would never take it again, because by then I knew that it would be risky, a novel platform. So, and I also wanted to mention, as I mentioned, the Janssen vaccine was paused um, after a much lower number of events due to clustering in time. They just paused the see if I can say this, chikungunya vaccine. I don't know if I can say this properly. IXCHIQ, for patients 60 and over because of cardiac and neurological problems. There were 5 patients hospitalized. I mean, compare that, and they just paused that May 9th until they get more safety data. So, I mean, pausing is a thing, right? That was a live attenuated virus, and they're looking at post marketing reports, which could mean anything, but I imagine it would mean VAERS as well, which is a post marketing report, but I don't know if they're looking at other internal data. And yeah, again, I think that looking for the benefit risk profile again and reassessing that might really make a world of difference now. And I think that's all I have to say right now. Yeah.
All right, all right. Well, thank you so much for going over this super complex process and this super complex, documents. There's so many little things to look at when it comes to these FDA regulations and all this stuff that many of us we haven't really paid attention to, but it's important to know what's going on, what they're doing. But regarding this last slide here, right? We have one, two, three, four. All of us and all of our audience, right? Probably most of America, want number four, right? We want remove from market, because quite unfortunately, millions of Americans have been harmed. And like you said, these other vaccines, I mean, they're just pulling them off the market after 5 reports. In the past decades, they were pulling them off for tens, maybe 100, few hundred reports. And we're in the thousands, we're in the tens of thousands, and nothing, basically nothing. And so, we're gonna keep pushing, and we're gonna keep advocating and highlighting the risks of these shots, and because we don't want more of our neighbors, our family members, to be irreversibly harmed or disabled or killed by these products. And so, Dr. Taccetta, is there anything else you want to say to our audience before we end this live stream?
Oh, um, not really, Nick. I just think that I just wish that more people had access to alternative media such as this, because without an awareness, one can't make these decisions. I mean, my husband told me if he didn't know me, married to me, he probably would have taken it. And I was raised in the system, in trained, trained. I did my internship. I did a pediatric. I trained in pathology, but my first year, my internship for the clinical part was what they call a transitional year and involved mostly pediatrics. I gave these vaccines. Uh, my son was vaccinated as a child, and it's only over a growing awareness that we can make decisions that are better for us. What is that saying? You do better when you know better. So I think that the our agencies and MAHA, I think they've made a great step in the right direction, and I applaud them for that. I mean, I'm so excited about that, but I think we can do better.
Yes, yes, I agree. We can do better. We are making positive strides in many aspects aside from vaccines. But yes, we have to keep going. We have to go much further. And I want to thank you again so much for coming on
My
the show today, doing all that work, doing all that investigative work to share, to the public. It's so important. And, keep up the great work. And again, thank you so much for coming on today.
my pleasure. Take care, Nick. Bye, everybody.